how can private organizations, whether foundations, corporations, work with government for scalable, renewable resources. So we love working with PSFG. Alex is amazingly creative in bringing her community together, which runs such a wide spectrum of peace and security, and really thinking about the needs of peace building and how we can work together. So we're very, very grateful to Peace and Security Funders Group for organizing this panel. And Alex, I welcome you. Thank you, and if you'll introduce your amazing panelists.
Great. So thank you, Melanie, and thank you, everybody, for sticking with us on the last day of the conference. As Melanie said, I'm Alex Thoma. I'm the Executive Director of PSFG, and we're a network of about 67 foundations and philanthropists who together collaboratively invest about $300 million a year in peace and security issues. And our job at the PSFG is to help organize that and bring folks together. So we're really glad you're here to kind of dive a little bit into our world for about an hour. What we thought we would do with this panel is make it a little bit less traditional. So what we're going to do is do 4 lightning talks back to back, 5 minutes apiece, to give you a sense of what is the landscape of peace and security funding, both from the private philanthropic sector, which is what I'll be talking about, but also from the government, which my colleague Theo will talk about, and then really dig into one of the, as Melanie mentioned, sort of creative modalities that we have been exploring with our members, which is public-private partnerships, or PPPs. So we've asked 2 excellent folks to talk about that, and then we're going to reserve the remainder of the time, about 30 minutes, for a real dialogue. We always run out of time at the end for questions and discussions, but we really have purposefully left 30 solid minutes for all of us to talk together about this really important piece of the peace-building puzzle. So what I will do is introduce us in the order in which we are going to speak, and then just direct you to your wonderful packets for full bios on everybody you have up here. So first we'll be listening to Theo Sitar. He's the legislative Secretary for Peacebuilding Policy at the Friends Committee on National Legislation, Quakers, here in Washington, D.C. And Theo will give us an overview of what does government funding and peacebuilding look like, and what, especially now, what does it look like with the budgets being cut? What will that look like for our future in this field? Then you'll hear from me again, and I'll be talking about private philanthropic funding in this field, and I'll talk about the sort of who, what, when, where, and how of the private philanthropic sector, which I'm sure you're all very curious about. We'll then hear from my colleague Christine Johnson. CJ is a Foreign Affairs Officer at the Secretary of State's Office of Global Partnerships at the U.S. State Department, and CJ will be talking about public-private partnerships, or PPPs, from the State Department perspective. And then finally, certainly last but not least, Michelle Gilfellen will speak to us about public-private partnerships from the NGO perspective. And Michelle has a great perspective on this, as she is the Director of Foundation and Corporate Engagement at Catholic Relief Services. And CRS has done a ton of PPPs, and so she'll give us the sort of perspective of best practices and lessons learned from an implementer or a grantee in this space. So without further ado, I think we'll have, yep, you're queued up, Theo, so you're ready to go. We'll have you go first.
Take out our crystal balls and figure out what in the world is U.S. government funding going to look like and for peace building. So I want to talk to you today about 4 things. The urgency of this moment, to put it into context, opportunity, commitment, and hope. We are in the midst of some massive tectonic shifts on a global scale in terms of international cooperation and the rule of law. Human rights and democratic processes are breaking down. From places like the Philippines, Brazil, Myanmar, Burundi, Yemen, Kenya, Venezuela, the list goes on, perhaps including here in the United States. For those of us who are in the US, though, the question that is at the heart of this challenge is, what is America's role in the world? Given that the global community is facing some of the most complex challenges of our time, how is the United States going to engage in a positive way to solve some of the most complex crises of our time. For the moment, at least, the answer that we are getting from the White House is pretty clear. And we saw this play out when the Trump administration released their budget for the federal government earlier this year. The Office of Management and Budget, this is the office that is responsible for putting together the federal government, which the president then ultimately sends to Congress as part of his budget request. The director of this office, Mick Mulvaney, said, this is a hard power budget, not a soft power budget. The president very clearly wants to send a message to our allies and to our potential adversaries that this is a strong power administration. And with that budget release, the administration proposed a nearly 32% cut to U.S. foreign assistance programs, while slashing many of the critical peacebuilding funding accounts that many of you in this room rely on to carry out your programs across the world. 32%. So next, in this moment, is our opportunity. I continue to believe, in spite of what you hear in the headlines, that Congress actually does present us with some really great opportunities. Congress, in a bipartisan way, is pushing back against some of these cuts. This provides a tremendous opportunity for the peacebuilding community, for us to speak during this moment to shape what the future of our field is going to look like in relation to the U.S. government. When this budget was released, we heard voices from across the Hill, across Capitol Hill, pushing back against these cuts. Republican Senator Lindsey Graham said that this budget is dead on arrival. Republican Senator Marco Rubio said foreign aid is less than 1% of the federal budget and critical to our national security. And in fact, when the Senate just a couple of weeks ago released their version of the budget, in the introduction, they said this: the administration's apparent doctrine of retreat, which also includes distancing the United States from collective and multilateral dispute resolution frameworks, serves only to weaken America's standing in the world. This is a Republican Congress pushing back against the Republican White House. The accounts that are included in the graph that is on the screen right now include many of the peacebuilding accounts that we rely on. And just for comparison, the numbers that I put up on the screen include the level of peacebuilding funding from FY16, FY17, where FCNL and many in our community think it should be at about $4.9 billion, where the White House request was, and where the FY18 budget levels are from the House and the Senate. The FY18 levels haven't actually been passed into legislation, into law yet, but this is the initial legislation that's coming out of Congress. Many of the accounts that are included in this graph include the Complex Crises Fund, the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations, at the State Department, the Human Rights and Democracy Fund, reconciliation programs at USAID, conflict mitigation and management, the Office of Transition Initiatives, peacekeeping funding, USIP, and the Atrocities Prevention Fund, just to give you an idea of what the numbers on this graph actually are representing. So look at the differences between each year and look at the trend lines. I'm sorry to say that the trend lines are not working in our favor, even with the bipartisan Congress pushing back against cuts from this particular administration. So then this brings me to commitment, and hopefully a challenge to many of you in this room. For our community This is a time to commit to work to increase funding levels. It's not going to be easy. We're going to need to be in this for the long haul. We need to commit to work to actually increase these funding levels and figure out how we're going to do that in the next several years, perhaps decade. And finally, hope. I actually remain hopeful in spite of this, that the peace-building community actually has the answers for some of the most challenging, complex problems of our times. This is what this conference has been about, is coming up with innovative thinking to shape our future. And I'm hopeful that we can shape the future of US engagement with the world. It behooves us to get creative in our advocacy and to focus on Congress, in our partnerships, as my colleagues are going to talk about, and how we frame peace building to a broader audience who are not in the room today. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm ready. Sorry, technical difficulties. Always happens. And do I have to just, there we go. I got it, Laura. Great. So, what I'm going to be doing in the next few minutes is giving you perhaps a little bit more of a positive angle on this. And that's the sort of teaser, which you'll have to wait till the last slide to see. But I'm going to talk about the private philanthropic sector's funding of peace building. So all of this data, by the way, is from the Peace and Security Funding Index, which is PSFG's annual index. We've committed to putting this out. This is the second year we've done it, but we're committed to putting it out every year from now until forever. You can find all of this data and a lot more data and stories and really geek out online. It's peaceandsecurityindex.org, but don't go there just yet. Go there after this panel. And what we wanted to do is sort of showcase what this field looks like writ large and then really dig into the little pieces of the field. So let me just give you an overview of the entire peace and security funding field, and then we'll dig in. So entirely over the field, there are about 290 funders, making about 7,500 grants, totaling around $357 million in 2014. And it's 2014 data because the data is always a couple of years old. So that's the picture of writ large the peace and security funding field. Within that, 4% of that funding goes towards peace building specifically. So that's 56 funders making 220 grants across about $15.7 million. May seem kind of small, perhaps. I mean, actually, let me just take a poll. Who thinks that 15.7 million is a small number? That you're, okay, well, we all want more money. And who thinks that, who's surprised by that number, actually seeing that? Like, oh, that's actually, okay, David. Just David. Awesome. So actually, based off of your feedback last year at AFP, actually, when we presented the first index, what we heard back from you all was that we want to see more nuance, more nitty-grittiness. We want to see not just peace and conflict resolution writ large, but really the different sub-issue areas. So that's what we did. We actually pulled out peace building as a specific line item, which is the 15.7 million. We also pulled out conflict resolution, peace negotiations, and a bunch of other things, which some of you all in the actual practitioner field may lump together when you're thinking about peace building. So together, if you pull together peace building, conflict resolution, and peace negotiations, we're at about $24 million for this field. And if you're curious, it's not up here, but the median size grant is around $24,000, $25,000 for peace building. So it may seem small, but we're here to reassure you that peace building is an actual top priority for peace and security funders. It's in the top 10 top peace and security funding priorities for our field. What we also are actually pretty hopeful about is that the funding in this field is actually, in peace building specifically, is actually steady, and we actually think it's growing. So I'll get to that in a second. The question we usually get secondarily after everyone's like, okay, now we kind of get a picture of what's out there is, who are these peace and security funders? Who are the top funders? So I'll give you 5 of the top funders, but then encourage you to go to the Peace and Security Funding Index website to actually get the top 25 funders. And you can do that for all the 23 different sub-issue areas, which is, I think, really cool. So the top 5 funders in peace building are One, I knew I would forget this. Carnegie Corporation of New York, they're all PSFG members, so I'm sorry for forgetting your names. Carnegie Corporation of New York, the GHR Foundation, based in Minneapolis, Court Aid, Rockefeller Brothers Fund, and Humanity United. And the other top ones you can find online. So now that you know who these folks are, how much they're funding, here's a little snapshot of where they're funding. Not surprisingly, most of the grants, about 30-something%, go to sub-Saharan Africa. That's the grants. Most of the actual funding, about 21%, goes to North America. And that's mostly for infrastructure and advocacy organizations like the Alliance for Peacebuilding, for example, who are based in North America. Finally, what are the top strategies of the peacebuilding funding field? The top strategies that are being funded by our members are, first and foremost, research and evaluation. Again, that won't be much of a surprise. And then the second is capacity building and technical assistance. But what I actually find more interesting about this slide than anything else is that 30% of grants in the peacebuilding sector are for general operating support. And you may say, well, Alex, that's only about like a third. That's not actually a lot. We want to see more, and we also want to see more. We are encouraging all of our members to increase as much as possible general operating support. But actually, 30% is about twice the level of what we're seeing in all the other fields across philanthropy. So philanthropy writ large, human rights, climate, arts, healthcare, whatever, as well as in the peace and security funding field itself, it's about 16%. So 30% is huge. And I think that actually says something about the trust and the relationships that you all have been able to build with the funders in this field to increase that pot of money of general operating support. I will leave you with a little bit of hope, a little more hope, hopefully, than Theo, which is that between 2014 and 2015, we saw a $3 million increase in peacebuilding funding. So again, $3 million isn't going to, break the bank, but it's actually an increased trend, and we're excited to sort of see what else happens in the years to come as we continue to monitor this field. But because it's not that much money, we are actually really excited about the opportunity that public-private partnerships and leveraging those with the US government, which, even though it's decreasing, remains the largest peace and security funder, one of the largest in the world. So to talk about that, I'm going to invite CJ up and then Michelle to give you a little bit more nuance into what those look like and what that looks like for us. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm so excited to be here. While they put up the slides, I just want to say, I started off as a medic in the military, and I was in Iraq 3 different times, working and seeing the environment there and just the need for building peace and stability and conflict resolution. So to be here in front of all of you today is sort of like a dream of mine. I always wanted to work in the government, and I wasn't totally sure where I would fall. I knew I wanted foreign affairs, but I found my home in partnerships. So I'm excited to talk about public-private partnerships with you all, because that actually is a passion of mine. So to start you off, I want to ask you a little question. What do dating and public-private partnerships have in common? Okay? And we're going to answer this as we go along. One of the main reasons I'm talking to you today is to give you hope and give you ideas for opportunity to engage the U.S. government and the State Department for public-private partnerships in the future. One of those opportunities falls in offices like mine, the Office of Global Partnership. Our main goal is to build public-private partnerships, but focused in a collaborative working relationship with government and with, all different sectors. So we want to talk about the power of partnerships. Okay, first off, we want to talk about, basically, we've got our mission of state here, and through partnerships, but not only that, leveraging creativity, innovation, and core business resources for partners, we want greater impact. What we've realized now in our office, our main initiative initially was just to promote the use of partnerships throughout the State Department to sort of help employees understand how they could go about creating maybe an informal agreement, but also using innovative methods and sort of creative policy-making methods with the use of maybe business models or private sector tools, and kind of bring up conversations that were worth pushing forward as far as partnerships go. So we are working as a convener. A lot of people like to come to the State Department to talk. We do things like roundtables, and we invite people in to, do prizes, competitions, challenges, and talk about issues related to, peace building, conflict, and stability. We also work as a highlighter or catalyzer. We like to create projects. We like to instigate. We like to be known as sort of the disruptors, the change makers of the State Department. And so we encourage the use of engaging the private sector in different sectors to forward our goals in diplomacy and development. So catalyzer in the sense that we like to highlight the work of State Department employees, but public-private partnerships across the USG. So this is where the opportunity comes in for civil society organizations, peace-building groups to come in and talk to the department or other USG communities like ourselves in the Office of Global Partnerships to think of new ways and think of how we can partner together to have greater impact and reach more people, and really bring in these ideas in order to create new methods of policy making which include everyone. One thing that we've really realized is in order to create the most reach is to have all different sectors involved. And this also, this can play in development, but in policy making as well. And so we like to offer opportunity for everyone to come in and engage each other and just maybe even instigate new conversations. So an example might be, we just had a blockchain at State Forum the other day, which has had me running around like crazy. And really all we did was we sort of thought, oh, this is really being used in the private sector. It's a really hot topic right now. It's like the sexy thing to talk about, right? So we brought in all different groups, and we said, we want to sit down and just talk to you. Where do you think this new blockchain ledger technology could be used to help stabilize land ownership overseas, or maybe in trafficking in persons, supply chains and things like that? You would not believe the amount of people that came in with wonderful ideas. Not only that, coming together in these roundtables really offers an opportunity to also help the government identify these gaps and how they can be filled with, NGOs, civil society, or even private sector companies working together. So, potential partners. This is where the dating relationship comes in. So part of what I do in my office is I help with our PPP training, and we actually engage with other State Department employees, embassies, and other USG, and we bring them in, and we even have some spots for NGOs as we've had people join us, and that's just to learn about how the USG actually, creates partnerships, the memorandum of understanding, and just the opportunity that we have. And that's really to push forward this idea that partnerships is the way to go, right? So we look into various partnerships. So the reason I bring up the dating experience is because we often need to sort of identify what partners work together. And this is where I encourage you guys to reach out and talk to us more. And just bring ideas to the table, okay? And this is where you kind of figure out which partners work for you, and ultimately identify innovative tools as well where you can come and collaborate with us. These are just some examples of the partnerships we have recently. That little one, the VIP, is actually me. I'm a product of a partnership, a public-private partnership, so I'm very passionate about it. Recently we did the Unreasonable Goals. It was an accelerator program for entrepreneurs that were using unique methods to forward the Sustainable Development Goals, and we actually had an accelerator program for them. This next one is one I'm very passionate about. These are the innovative tools. I'm in team innovation, and so I try to encourage people to come up with new ways to engage with each other in more informal ways. So we have like blockchain at State, like I mentioned, roundtables for Zika, but also this Bold Line, which is a P3 accelerator we're actually launching this week. So what I want to leave you with is that there are ample opportunities right now to engage and really make a difference and bring in your ideas to the U.S. government, and that includes things like the Bold Line Accelerator, where you can pitch your P3 idea, and when you're looking to scale it up, we're going to be accepting applications. Not only that, we have lots of other opportunities. We have Global Partnerships Week coming up. So one way to get involved with the U.S. government is to find the conduit or that entry way, which is usually an office like ours, and then we can also put you in touch with all the different communities that are encouraging the same thing that we are. And so hopefully this brings a little hope, and not only that, excitement to the future of funding and peace building, and the opportunity that's out there to just engage in ways that maybe are less costly, but also can use methods like crowdsourcing to really get the word out there. And so I'll end with that.
So I have the great opportunity to share a little bit about the mechanics of bringing something together, as my colleagues have shared. I just thought I'd call attention to this photo because these are community leaders in Central African Republic who are discussing the impact of trauma workshops that they recently had in their community, and they're continuing their plan of support. And it's representative of what I'll share a little bit with you today of our public-private partnership. It's our Central African Republic Interfaith Peacebuilding Partnership. So I want to walk you through a little bit about how that came together. And CIPP, as we call it, really is doing three things. It's engaging communities in trauma healing, it's building social cohesion, and then thirdly, it's strengthening the local economy, whether it's with small incubators and micro businesses to youth for youth employment. So my question is, from a CSO perspective, what do you need to know about engaging in a public-private partnership? And I'd say there are four things. 1, champions. 2, patience. 3, persistence. And 4, a little bit of luck to make it all happen. But on the first part, you know, CJ was talking a lot about bringing lots of different people together. And in any partnership, you have to bring various groups, various stakeholder perspectives together. You have to have a compelling urgency, you have to have the right teams in place, you have to have a good track record. But you really need champions, and I'm going to give you 2 examples. One, our very own Peace and Security Funders Group, kind of behind the scenes is what I'd say a positive agitator, and really was advocating for collective action around shared interests in CIR. So we have them working, helping to advocate. And then many of you in this room know Nancy Lindborg, who was formerly at USAID, and she was also an important creative and positive agitator to initiate discussions and creatively bring partners to the table. So that's 2 things that are really critical. Secondly, as in any kind of partnership and planning, you need some patience because everyone has various perspectives. In our experience, we really found it important to work with our USAID mission on the ground, to work with our colleagues in DC, to work with our implementing partners, which were many, and to work with potential other partners, investors, whether it's foundation or the private side. So that co-creation and co-development, which is really essential, CJ was mentioning a little bit of that, was really important to this partnership. And that takes time, it takes give and take, openness, negotiation, and patience. So that was very critical for all of us. Third, this is persistence. You have to anticipate challenges because in something that is complex and it requires lots of attention, you're going to have some roadblocks along the way. And I think all of those who had a vested interest in making this happen had really creative ideas, but we also had a lot of things to get in place. You know, it's great to have your timeline, but you have to anticipate some of the challenges because you may not always stick to your timeline. And I would say this is where one of our key partners, Alex mentioned the GHR Foundation, so I know some of you know GHR and they're in the room today. Were really critical for us because they came in as an early interested partner and were really essential in kind of helping to co-create some ideas, sharing their vantage point, what they were hoping to get out of it and what they'd be willing to put in. And I would say they also used their influence both as a partner and a funder to kind of help to undo some of the roadblocks that we had along the way, because they had their own network of partners in DC and with others in the USG. So that was really essential. We were all working as a team, and I have to say, for me and for our experience, they were really critical for all the way through, and still to this day. And then the fourth is luck, and this is where my colleague Andreas Hippel from GHR and I were talking about this, and we were saying, it's not often where all the timelines actually align. You have your grant makers and your funders' timeline of getting something in front of the board. You have our timeline due to the U.S. government. We have to sign letters of commitment and get everybody to the table, and you have to have all of that. You have to be thinking about all of that, and it's not always perfect, but you also can see where can you move some of those timelines, where there's some flexibility. And in our case with GHR, for example, who came in from the beginning, they were able to submit and kind of pitch some idea to their board at several different points to kind of help them understand where the interest was for the foundation to get us ready for when we could actually sign the agreement with the U.S. government. So that was really we were working together as true partners, and that was very essential. Then the last thing I'll leave, and I think this is something that you all know very well, it's just a comment as we look to the future and look at challenges. In peace building or working in fragile states, this as being one example, you have to have a tolerance for risk. Not everybody has that tolerance for risk, but some of the folks that Alex works with know this very well. And it was really important for us to be able to tap into partners who were able to, who would be, tolerate a risk and know that the implementation plan may not always fall exactly as we hoped it would, because there's insecurity to this day in CAR. So some of our timeline has had to shift. And I think as we all work together strategically, we have to really galvanize efforts to look at that urgency, that immediate need, but also understand that taking risk and finding the partners who can actually invest in that risk will help galvanize efforts. So thank you very much.
Great, so I'll just stand up so I can moderate discussion or questions. This is thankfully it's not an NFL Janet Jackson flaw. There we go. One-piece dress. So if anyone has any clarifying questions, happy to take those first, or maybe we can just jump into the discussion. Braves, I have questions too, so if you don't ask, I will. Sure, over here in the front. Maybe if you have a loud voice, you can.
I do have a loud voice. I'll use the mic though. Jenny Vaughn from Mercy Corps, thanks a lot. I have a question about going a little bit back to the categorization of programs that we consider to be peace-building programs. And it's stemming from a lot of the discussions that I've heard over the course of this conference about the necessity of identifying and addressing root causes of conflict, addressing governance issues, addressing issues of marginalization and grievance. So for me, peace building is actually very broad. Curious to hear the thoughts about how that might be evolving within each of these different funding sectors.
Sure. I'll start. So for us, it was remarkably, maybe not remarkably, but it was quite difficult to get at what all of the things mean. What does peace building mean? What is encompassed in good governance? What is encompassed in, multinational institutions, whatever. All of those things, all of those 23 subcategories for us, we had to come up with the taxonomy. So what is included in that? And the way in which we did that, anyway, from the funding perspective, was to include funders first and foremost, because again, this was the way in which funders talk about their funding internally, to their boards, to their trustees, et cetera. So it's a little quirky in that sense, but we then also worked with peace-building organizations, or peace and security organizations writ large, and with experts in the government, some of CJ's colleagues at State Department. So we tried to get as much input as possible into our definition of peace building. And I actually wrote it down. The definition that we use is grants involving a range of measures targeted to reduce the risk of lapsing or relapsing into conflict by strengthening capacities at all levels, local to global, and to lay the foundations for sustainable peace and development. which includes peacemaking, locally led peace building, interfaith dialogue, and conflict transformation. That's the definition we use given sort of that process, but I don't know if anyone else, maybe from the State Department perspective, or if Theo knows from the federal budget.
I mean, I think the one thing that I wanted to add, I mean, in terms of our work, particularly with Congress in arguing for funding for peace building, is that we argue for flexibility, and particularly flexibility in how money gets moved out of state and USAID to be able to move it quickly, right? I mean, and especially as many of you know, as crises break out and our government is looking to respond, if we're not able to move resources quickly and be able to take action quickly, then the breakout point, it's really difficult to intervene at that point, and then the tools for intervention then actually become smaller. So we argue for greater flexibility and evolving funding streams to actually allow for transfer from different accounts, or the Complex Crises Fund is an example where it's the one account that exists that's not tied, that it's not earmarked for a particular region or a particular type of program, but can be moved in a relatively rapid pace, right? So that's, I mean, I think that's where government funding needs to evolve to. I actually think the public-private partnerships that my colleagues spoke about, I think we actually do need to be doing more of that, especially as the outlook and the trend lines are not looking great, right? And for what that's worth, yeah. It's a good question, though. It's good to be thinking.
Can I just follow up on language? Because I know it's something that Melanie talks a lot about, and how we talk about this field. And that was a perfect example. Well, to me, peace building means this. To you, it means this. On the Hill, when you go up there, your lobbyists, you go up there a lot, daily, I hope. I know. When you're talking with members of Congress and champions, as CJ was mentioning, what's the sort of language that resonates with them about this field when you're talking about, you really need to increase these budgets? Like, what language do you use to talk about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think, especially over the last number of years, and with people like Senator Lindsey Graham, Marco Rubio, and that quote that I used, the language is national security. I mean, and I think it, in our field, as much as me personally, perhaps, and maybe for many people in this room as well, as uncomfortable as we may be with using that type of language, from a U.S. government perspective, the number one objective of U.S. government actors is U.S. national security, right? And then how does investing then in peace building and conflict prevention then ultimately is good for our national security? And that's an argument that continues to resonate. And I actually think that members are starting to pick that up. We hear that in the news interviews that they give as they push back on the Trump budget, right? Is that actually, no, in cutting down our funding in diplomacy and development is actually ultimately bad for our own national security. The hard power stuff, it can only go so far, but we need, so I think in terms of language, on the Hill that resonates, and I think the other thing that we need to be very, very good at and get better at is the evidence. There is, I mean, our community has the evidence base to show that this stuff works. But then how do we then translate to staffers on the Hill? I mean, I think that's my challenge, is actually, taking the evidence, making it a little bit more popularized for the audience on the Hill, and ultimately for audience outside of Washington, D.C.
Great. Up here?
Thanks, everyone. This is Anita Ernsthofer from CDA Collaborative Learning Projects. Thanks very much for your presentations, really insightful. We've talked a lot about systems change and systemic change over the past 3 days, including the type of systems and systemic change that might have to happen in the peace-building field in order to actually achieve, the systems change in the context in which we actually work. At the same time, Alex, you presented the increased funding, but at the same time, fairly small kind of grant allocations at the same time. So I wonder how these two conversations actually really go together, and maybe what the discussions might be, especially amongst the Peace and Security Funders Group, but also maybe in the public-private partnership discussions in terms of scale, and how do you actually really, contribute to more collective action in the peace-building field to have that systemic impact that we all want, instead of maybe really, incentivizing more individual action towards really more kind of collective and joint approaches. Thanks.
Well, I would ask you, so what would you say? What's your advice? I mean, I could answer mine, but it sounds more like it would be beneficial because this is meant to be a dialogue. What's your advice? How should we be having those conversations?
Well, I think we have seen, this is my personal opinion, and there are many other people in this room who might want to speak to this, but I think that it's difficult sometimes to really leverage engagement and have that collective impact through very extremely small allocations. I was wondering what the current thinking is amongst funders and donors in terms of really incentivizing collective action, maybe having more joint and pulled up approaches in terms of funding allocations to fund networks rather than individual organizations. So I wonder what the current debate is.
So again, I'll start, and if you all have anything to add. Did someone raise their hand, Michelle? What are you signaling to me?
I think somebody in the back.
Okay.
Also.
I'm not sure where. Do you have something to add to this question? Okay. So I'll just go ahead and answer. I think yes. We're actually seeing a lot more pooled funds. I'm personally, so I've been in the philanthropic field now for about 11, 12 years. And even in that short, long, subjective amount of time, I'm seeing a lot more funders come together and pool their funds together. In fact, one of our members, the Nexus Fund, is starting a dangerous speech pooled fund. And that's now, they launched, I don't know, Dylan, last week, 2 weeks ago or something like that, yeah? And we're seeing a lot more of that across the peace and security field, not just in peace building. But I think a lot of it, too, comes from you all. I mean, the funders, there are different perceptions of funders, but a lot of our members want to hear what you think. Don't just tell them what you think they should hear, but say, look, and especially now in this time, this is the time to do it. I mean, clearly, this, things are not going well in so many different ways. And so now is the time to say, look, we need something different. And this is what we from the ground think should happen. And I think they would be receptive now, if ever. And we're seeing that trend because we are seeing more pooled funds just in the past few months, year and a half or so.
I think maybe from our perspective, it's related to this point about systems change. One thing in this concrete example, I think that everyone who came to the table was interested in. One of the hallmarks of CRS's work is really building the capacity of our partners. Mm-hmm. So we're working very intentionally with this interreligious platform, which is a local organization. It's a platform bringing all different religious leaders together in Central African Republic. And the idea over the course of this is really to hand off and transition responsibilities there. So not for CRS really to be the lead, but we're really kind of coming underneath and really supporting. And I think the various funders and interested parties who came to the table really liked that concept. And they saw that's the key to helping change inside and for the local community to take ownership. So we're just like a conduit really for that to happen. And other people in this room might have perspectives or even from a funding perspective, but that was something that was really critical in our conversations.
There was a lady in the back who I think has the mic. Yeah.
All right, this is very dramatic. Okay.
Better be a good question.
Oh, this is going to be amazing. You're going to love it. Recently, my organization, we got a contract with the Public Health Department of Los Angeles County to do Resilience Youth. We're doing total peace building narrative change campaign, but it's $1 million grant funded by the Public Health Department of California that's transferred through a local organization. So it wasn't started like that, but it ended like that. So I'm wondering, what's an untapped market? It's obviously not a private partnership, but it's definitely an untapped market for peace building, right? I don't know how many people here are funded by the Public Health Department. And so I'm wondering what other frontiers or sectors, markets that we haven't tapped yet that maybe we know people we can start talking to and build some kind of education. First, this partnership started with education relationship, and then it was like, we need this. The original campaign was to curb drug and alcohol abuse of youth. And through our research and conversations, we said, do youth just use drugs and alcohol because they want to, or is it lack of resilience? And now we're just doing peace building.
That's really interesting. CJ, Michelle? I'll just say that that the one that popped to mind as you were stalling for time for you guys. The one that popped to mind as you were asking the question is, and again, this is depending on your appetite for this, is corporations. Melanie and I were at a really interesting convening earlier this week, and a bunch of others in this room as well, that was convened by Search for Common Ground, and talking about, a lot of stuff. But one of the things that came up were there are corporations out there like Unilever, for example, who are doing actually really great work in peace building. So the first thing that came into my mind were, again, if you can stomach it, reaching out to our corporate pals and either through their corporate social responsibility programs or whatnot, just reaching out to them. I know that, we've talked with Chevron, we've talked with Caterpillar, and they're doing peace building work because it benefits them along a lot of different ranges, brand and whatever, but that's the first thing that popped into my mind.
Yes, I know when we approach private sector in order to build a public-private partnership, we often think about how we have these shared values. Now, like you're talking about with language, oftentimes one company is looking at it as far as it benefits them, and we use a certain language for them, and then when we present the idea at the USG, we're able to bring it up and say how it affects this, like countering violent extremism is something that, we are addressing, and it's really on the radar, and as the Secretary's office, we're really focused on the particular agenda and issues of the Secretary, and so that's where we focused the partnerships that we build in our office ourselves. But not everybody likes the phrase countering violent extremism. However, if we, if we can relate the fact that we're putting out education and information on alcohol abuse or drug abuse in a particular area and how that could relate to building resiliency and ultimately affect, this countering violent extremism, a mandate, then you could get multiple parties involved that all, don't necessarily use the same language when they get their champions, or they bring it back home, but when it comes down to it, we have all these shared values and benefits, and that really encourages more people to be involved. So, like you said, the peace building is such a broad way to do it, but actually in our office, it's somewhat of a benefit to have it more of that broad language, because then we have more opportunity to involve more partners from different sectors and get the okay. And this is also where more of those informal, non-contract, non-grant things come into play in our office, because we do more collaboration and back and forth, and because we have a little bit of leadway, because it's more informal.
Michelle, did you want to add something?
No, you've probably already thought this, but I was just thinking of framing your work. You're doing peace building work, but it's also to improve health outcomes. So there's probably funders who are very specifically focused on health outcomes, even in California itself, like focused, who you might be able to it kind of gets to CJ's point of how you frame the issue. And if that's the overall goal, like you're using this as a methodology, peace building, so that'd be another way, another tool to be thinking, I think, about your work.
So I think maybe we'll take these two questions, these two ladies, and then I'm being told that we need to wrap up soon. So maybe take two questions back to back, and then, or points of dialogue, up to you, and then we'll wrap up.
Hello, thanks. My name is Eleanor Gorman. I'm with CMI at this conference. I work as a consultant. So I just wanted to make a general observation, really, and come back to your wonderful question on systemic change. I think it goes to the heart of it. And whilst there's been different conversations around the conference, I'm sorry that we didn't really get a keynote in plenary where we could investigate that, because it means different things to different people. But I'd like to thank Theo for reminding us of the politics of this, the greatest system changes as citizens and governments, and what's foreign policy, what's the purpose of our governments and the United Nations and the structures of global peace and security. And sometimes when we get into talk of fundraising, sadly, we get divided and we get too operational or technical about proposals and funding lines and budget lines. So this comes back to the opening session for me of the conference about what is our messaging about peace, making the case for peace. And as a community, if we do that, we all benefit, and we are the system. But some of these questions have legacy. For example, I think of the United Nations, and I'm sorry I wasn't here for day one, the Global Peacebuilding Fund, and why civil society organisations, why it's very hard and hard for INGOs to get access to some of the global pool funds and the World Bank funds, and what are the purposes and missions of these types of funds, and so the segregation that happens between statutory, not-for-profit, etc. And then the roles of foundations, which often tend to be catalytic, small, but also I welcome the encouragement for that sector to also think about what their contribution to catalysing systemic change and helping us to respond to what are real political challenges. So I think whilst catchy phrases like systemic change, etc., are definitely pushing us, they mean different things in different contexts, but I think the underlying message for me is about the peace-building ecosystem itself, which is under threat, and how we respond, and there's a political claim to be made as much as a financial one. And I think if the peace-building community can be more unified in its case for peace and messaging for peace, and the advocacy and political stand-up for peace, which will be adversarial, I think, at certain points, then the resources will come and the political support for that. But I think it's a political task as much as anything else.
Thank you. And last.
Thank you. I'm Teresa Dumazi from Conciliation Resources. In the UK at the moment, there's a bit of a trend.
Can you put the mic a little closer?
Sorry. In the UK at the moment, there's more of a trend towards collaborations between universities and practitioner organisations. We're part of a consortium, and I'm often struck that they have a 4-year. Can you still hear it? No. You have a. Sometimes they have a longer time on which to work at a problem. So there's 4 or 5 year grants, and we have 18 months grants to tackle the problem. And so these are kind of fruitful collaborations. The universities have to prove there's a degree of uptake for their research, and we have the benefit of learning. So I wondered if there was equivalent trend in the US, and whether those collaborations are on the hand.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. The short answer is I don't know. I'm not sure if that's happening. I don't know if my colleagues know a little bit better than I do. And then we're going to be pulled off stage by force. But
I mean, in our example, universities are very much part of our partnership. And I think to kind of your point about research and the research line with funding, I mean, they're coming in to kind of take a part of some really strong research, in the country. So that was really a critical part of the design. So you have your funders, you have your other implementing partners, you have the different religious communities, you have university and research. So that's all really coming together to kind of look at systems change and look at behavioral change as well from different methodologies. So I do see some of that as a trend. And I think it was in your in CJ's slide when you look at all the different players, who you're bringing together as thought partners. And universities are very much there, and I think we only will continue to see that more.
Great. Okay. Thank you all very much, and thank my panelists for joining me for this session. I think Melanie's going to give us instructions, so stay put for a second.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
So everyone, please stay here for just a moment. First of all, thank you, Alex and Michelle and CJ and Theo. That was such a wonderful and transparent conversation. It was great. So this is actually the last time they'll be in plenary. I encourage you to network over lunch. We have amazing panels after lunch, and then the workshops are truly extraordinary. We've been working now for 3 months with all of the workshop organizers to give you the most hands-on experience. So please go to those and really enjoy them. I want to thank all of you. I want to thank our donors, our sponsors. I feel so privileged to be able to come every day to work with the people at AFP and with all of you in this much larger peace-building family. To thank those of you who've come from all around the world and from Washington itself. It's been such a great pleasure. But now we have a really wonderful video in store that Julia Roig has organized. She has filmmaking talents we never knew about that captures the spirit of this conference. And just while Julia is teeing this up, a final reminder, please fill out your conference surveys. This helps us to make sure that the next conference is everything that you want it to be.
I know I'm between you and lunch, and she's pulling up the video now. Sorry, I should have checked to make sure it was all queued up. Like she said, this is the last time we're going to be together. You guys are all going to go to lunch, then you're going to go to the panels, and we never get to have a moment as a community again to say to each other, wow, wasn't this great to be together? Didn't we need this? To be together, to have these conversations. It's been inspiring. Every single one of you know how much work it took to do this. You know that the Alliance for Peacebuilding, really above and beyond, every day thinking about you and your needs, a lot of intellectual leadership, and I think it's a special time for us to recognize them before we leave as a group.